On April 19, 1995, a 4,000-pound truck bomb brought down the federal building in Oklahoma City. Amid the chaos, frightened families waited for news of their loved ones. The nation watched as hundreds of dedicated search teams from around the country hunted for bodies, dead or alive, in the rubble.
There's not a lot of room up there. I'd like you to stay with me when we get up there.
In this same rubble lay the scorched and shattered fragments of the bomb that created this devastation. Small pieces of evidence in a mountain of debris. But Oklahoma City is just one chapter in the story of the bombing of America. The nightly news is filled with tales of tragedy and terror. Bombing incidents have tripled in the past decade. In Rochester, New York, 6 bombs were delivered to 6 different locations, killing 5 people in a single day. In Los Angeles, 2 policemen were killed while trying to defuse a bomb. And near Baltimore, a man killed himself, his wife, and their 3 young children. This is what remained of their car after the bomb exploded. Across the country, dozens of teenagers are injured or killed building bombs every year. Many learned how from the internet, where bomb instructions can be downloaded at the touch of a button. In 1997, more than 2,000 bombings or attempted bombings occurred in this country, an average of 6 new cases every day. To solve these horrendous crimes, law enforcement works closely with forensic scientists at every step of the investigation. Former chief of the explosives unit in the FBI laboratory, Chris Ronay.
Bombings are a very unusual kind of a crime in that the only evidence that remains is the fragments that are left after the explosion. So that an expert in bombings or an expert in chemistry or an expert in handwriting or DNA needs to take the pieces, evaluate them all, and then present a total picture filling in the gaps of what's missing. And so a forensic laboratory is essential, certainly in bombing investigations.
But one bomber foiled every forensic effort for almost 2 decades, the Unabomber. The capture of Theodore Kaczynski ended one of the largest and most expensive manhunts in the history of federal law enforcement. It began in May 1978 when an unusual package showed up at Northwestern University. A campus policeman decided to investigate. He was lucky that day. The bomb wasn't very powerful and his injuries were minor. It took 2 more explosions before authorities realized they were dealing with a serial bomber. That was Chris Ronay's contribution to the case.
On November 15th, 1979, I was directed to go out to the Dulles International Airport where a bomb had exploded on this airplane coming in from Chicago. I took the evidence into the laboratory and we started to examine it. And as soon as we had some information, we communicated that to Chicago, who was waiting to start covering leads, such as what's the return address? Who is it mailed to, if you can tell? What sort of device was it? And within a few days, Chicago came back to us and said, we've shown the photographs around, and we've located another bomb, and there are some real similarities here. We want to send it to you. And they did. And as soon as we looked at it, we made an identification. This was clearly made by the same guy that made the bomb on the airplane.
But who was he? No one claimed responsibility until the 4th bomb.
It wasn't until the 4th device, which was to the then president of United Airlines, that initials were affixed to the device. The initials FC, and they were affixed to the device in a way that they would purposely survive the explosion.
The bomber would sign almost all of his subsequent bombs, although it would be years before anyone knew what FC stood for. As the bombings continued, law enforcement gave this case a name. UN for the universities he attacked, A for the airlines. Unabomb. While his targets all had ties to science and technology, his motives were a mystery. That's one reason he was so hard to catch. The director of the Unabomb Task Force was Jim Freeman.
Most bombers are very open about the reason for their actions. They're mad at a particular corporation or a particular person. And it's, from the investigative standpoint, you work that backwards as to who has a grudge against that company or that person.
But there's no evidence that the Unabomber had a grudge against Percy Wood or Diogenes Angelakos or Hugh Scruton. It's unlikely he ever met David Gelernter or Charles Epstein or any of the 22 people he injured or 3 people he killed. In 1985, John Hauser was a young Air Force pilot with lifelong hopes of joining NASA. To help meet the requirements, he enrolled in an engineering graduate program at the University of California at Berkeley. It was there his dreams were shattered.
I was coming down here to get to work, working on my master's project work. And I saw over here on a table, I saw a small plastic box, a little bit like this one, and a 3-ring binder notebook sitting on top. There was a rubber band going around the 3-ring binder notebook. Well, I checked the notebook, saw that the pages inside were, by and large, appeared to be blank. And then I looked over on the right side and saw that there was a latch that was open. I thought, I wonder whose that is. I wonder if that's one of the other graduate students that regularly worked in this research laboratory. Well, seeing that it was open, I thought, well, let's check and see what it was. As I picked up on the latch, as I lifted this, there was a micro switch inside the device that blew up. So as I got to that point, it just blew it off to the side, just knocked my arm way over to the side like this. Took my Air Force Academy ring and shot it from like this position all the way over here to the wall, leaving an impression on the wall here where you could see the curvature stone and so forth on there. I grabbed this. My arm was now pretty weak because I had lost many of the muscles and so forth here. And as I stood there kind of looking, I noticed that blood was pooling in my arm, coming up to the level, and then starting to squirt out. You know, at this point I realized, you know, this is some serious business. And so I backed up a little bit and screamed for help, you know, somebody come and help me.
John's blood loss was severe, and he was blinded in one eye. The medics tried to recover his severed fingers, hoping that some could be saved. In the middle of this crisis, it was his flying career John worried about.
I can remember laying on the gurney in the emergency room. You know, my arm all swollen by the side. I guess I didn't realize how bad the damages were there. Asking, you know, I can't see out of my left eye. Am I going to be able to fly again? It was very, very, very difficult to accept that.
2 years later, investigators got a crucial lead in this now 9-year-old case. In a Salt Lake City parking lot, a woman witnessed the Unabomber place a package near her car. This is the man she saw as sketched by a police artist. A few years later, the picture was updated. After being observed, the Unabomber stopped bombing for 6 years. As the evidence accumulated over 2 decades, forensic scientists combed through thousands of fragments of metal, wood, and wire found at the crime scenes, hunting for a clue to the criminal's identity. But he was no ordinary bomber, as this computer database at the ATF shows. It holds a record of almost every bombing case in the nation, including the Unabomber. Every component he ever used is listed. But in each case, the source of the component was either homemade or unknown.
The Unabomber for many years was known as the junkyard bomber because the components that he would select would be very commonly available, perhaps available in a scrapyard, pieces of scrap wood, pieces of scrap metal. He has on occasion made and fashioned screws and other fasteners that could be purchased in a hardware store. It was clearly the intent of the bomb maker to conceal any potential lead value from the investigator from the outset.
The Unabomber even peeled labels off batteries before putting them in his deadly devices. Investigators finally tracked down a suspect here in the wilderness of Montana. This is where Theodore Kaczynski lived as a recluse for 25 years. In the search of his cabin, investigators found a virtual bomb-making factory. Enough evidence to arrest Kaczynski for bomb possession. Among the items specified in the warrant were batteries and electrical wire, pieces of threaded pipe, and a long list of explosive chemicals. Whether any of these items can be connected to the Unabomber's crimes is a question only science can answer. Because catching a bomber is a partnership between science and good old-fashioned investigative work. This is how the hunt for a bomber begins. Finding the remnants of a bomb is like discovering the knife or gun at a murder scene. It's crucial evidence that may link a suspect to the crime. This is not a real bombing, although it was modeled after an actual case. These are police officers. Today, they're learning how to investigate a bombing. Heading up the training from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, Larry Casey.
The physical evidence recovered at a bomb scene is usually very heavily damaged. It's not easy to recognize as to what it originally was. So the process of recovering the pieces, putting the device together again, and following that trail is a very difficult one.
The crime scene extends as far as the furthest piece of evidence, and every fragment must be located. It's often hard to tell whether a piece of debris comes from the car or the bomb.
Here's one, kid, when you get...
The bomb that destroyed this car was not built by a criminal, but by our instructor, Larry Casey. Pipe and gunpowder are the main ingredients for the most common bombs used on America's streets. Even for the experts, bomb making is an extremely dangerous endeavor, and Larry Casey has no intention of giving a lesson. All of these components will survive the blast, but in bits and pieces. Even some fragments of tape should survive. If the students do their job well, they should be able to find it in the debris, and tape is often a good medium for fingerprints. The bomb is disguised inside a cardboard box and then placed in the car. But what happens when a bomb explodes? Every explosion begins with a thermal event, a rapid burst of fire or extreme heat. That's followed by a shock wave, powerful enough here to level an automobile. The hot, razor-sharp fragments from the bomb and the car travel at extremely high speeds, endangering everyone in the area. While there are many different types of explosives, they all work by releasing energy. In this pipe bomb, the energy begins to build when the gunpowder is ignited. Burning forces the powder to change form from a solid to a gas. The gas builds up inside until the pressure is so great that even a solid steel pipe bulges until it can no longer hold together. This explosion was filmed in extreme slow motion, 1 million frames a second.
This is a nice hole right here.
The damage that results can often tell the investigators a great deal about the bomb. Here they surmise a heavy end cap was propelled right through the door. They can even guess at the trajectory it might have taken.
Piece of a circuit board.
Recognizing the components is only half the work. They really want to know the manufacturer so they can track down where it was purchased.
Battery.
And once in a while, they're lucky.
Ever ready.
The brand name isn't obliterated in the blast. After the larger pieces are bagged, tagged, and sent to the lab, the real dirty work begins. They sift through the debris one shovelful at a time, looking for minute pieces of a bomb they've never
Not sure
seen.
what it is. I don't think it's from the car, though. I thought it was from the device.
It's the most important factor to be able to collect evidence, to be able to reconfigure the device, to know what type of device was used. Next to interviewing eyewitnesses, I think that's the paramount point of bombing investigation.
And Joe Hanlon knows that from personal experience.
A possible bomb explodes under the towering World Trade Center in New York. 5 people are killed, hundreds are injured.
At the time, the bombing of the World Trade Center was the worst act of terrorism on American soil. When the final toll was taken, 6 people died and more than 1,000 were injured. Joe Hanlon was a member of the first team of bomb investigators to enter the building.
I just didn't see how we were going to get it done. I mean, I knew we could get it done. I knew we would. I knew we had to get it done, but it was extremely intimidating.
This crime scene footage was shot in the first hours after the explosion. Hanlon and his team had orders to assess the site in preparation for evidence collection. The vehicles they encountered were badly damaged. But to an expert eye, it was clear that the cause of the damage was external, and the car parts found on the platform were all exterior parts. Then, Hanlon came across a few pieces that looked different from all the rest.
These vehicle parts were internal parts to a vehicle. It was a differential housing, pinion gear.
The severely twisted section of a vehicle frame then caught his eye.
I was pretty much willing to bet my paycheck that that particular part came from the vehicle that had carried the explosives. Upon closer examination and removing some of the residue, the grease, we could tell that it was a number that appeared to have been mechanically stamped into the metal, appeared to be significant in identifying the vehicle.
With this finding, Hanlon's orders to disturb nothing at the crime scene became tough to obey. The platform was unstable. It could collapse and bury that potentially critical evidence under tons of debris. So he went against orders and collected the evidence. 2 days later, the platform did collapse, around the same time that Hanlon learned from a colleague about the significance of his find.
He showed me a piece of paper and inquired if I knew what that was, and I said no. I said, it looks like the number that was on that frame. And he said, well, I have a vehicle identification specialist with me here. He said, he informs me that this is a VIN number, a vehicle identification number, and that we may well be able to trace this number down to the exact vehicle that was manufactured and where that vehicle was sent.
It was sent to this Ryder rental lot in New Jersey, where a man had rented the truck and then reported it stolen. Mohammed Salameh was arrested when he returned for his deposit.
It is rare that there is any one single piece that solves the crime. What I've found in general is it is a combination of efforts from a lot of different people with a lot of different disciplines, from chemists to investigators to bomb technicians, explosive specialists. More times than not, is what leads to the conviction of a person for a bombing.
It always takes a team of experts to solve a bombing. But once in a while, a single scientist makes a contribution so important it changes the entire course of an investigation, as it did in this case. In December 1989, a suspicious package was discovered at the 11th Circuit Appeals Court in Atlanta. When investigators x-rayed it, they saw the components of a live bomb inside. In fact, it looked exactly like a mail bomb that killed federal court judge Robert Vance 2 days earlier. The safest response would have been to evacuate the area and explode the bomb right there. But that would damage the best possible evidence, the bomb itself. So they chose the riskier route, to move the package to the bomb range where it could be disarmed. Retired ATF Special Agent Bob Holland
Was immediately summoned to the boss's office, where he told me that a bomb had been recovered at the 11th Circuit, and for me to get over there.
Nova has agreed not to show or describe the defusing process, because investigators don't want criminals to learn how to defeat their efforts. The bomb was disarmed intact and the evidence preserved. The hunt for the bomb maker began, although investigators had no immediate suspects. The next day, Bob Holland had an important story to tell at the regular monthly meeting of the Metro Bomb Group, a gathering of explosive experts from the Atlanta area. Holland was the only member of the group that had seen the courthouse bomb.
As all of you know, a device was recovered yesterday at the 11th Circuit. Here's a photograph of it before it was disarmed. It's a brown cardboard box wrapped in brown paper, excessive postage, a red and white address label with a typewriter that's malfunctioning with the letter R. Photographs of the device are included here. It's a very unusual device in that rather than being a standard pipe bomb, as this x-ray shows, it's a pipe bomb with flat end caps or flat plates welded to the end of the device.
The description of the bomb held great meaning for one member of the group.
If anybody gets any information on the possible perpetrator, please call Atlanta PD Bomb Squad, myself, or the FBI.
Lloyd Irwin, an ATF forensic chemist with more than 20 years' experience, was about to have a profound impact on this case.
Yeah, I've seen one built on that style before, back in the early 70s.
Yeah?
Yes, sure did. Worked on it in Macon, Georgia.
What did it look like?
Well, it was smaller than that. It had smaller pipe made out of aluminum alloy. It had square metal end plates, and it had 4 bolts going through it.
Lloyd Irwin was remembering a bomb from 1972, 17 years earlier.
End plates. I dropped 2 of them first.
He also recalled the name of the man who built it.
He went by the name of Roy Moody. He's You know, he's bound to be out. That's been a long time ago, the way they let people out of prison nowadays.
Lloyd Irwin has analyzed hundreds, perhaps thousands of bombs in his career, and he doesn't remember every one. What he does remember is the bomber's signature, those things that are unique to the maker and repeated time and time again. Thanks to Lloyd Irwin, the investigation focused on Walter Leroy Moody, a con man and career criminal who was eventually sentenced to 7 life terms plus 400 years in federal prison.
Amazing, isn't it? We got all of the computers and all of the fancy tools, and one man can remember one thing and solve multiple cases.
But good detective work combined with forensic science can be a powerful investigative tool. Here at the ATF's National Forensic Laboratory, scientists look for clues hidden in the burned and mangled evidence that was collected at a crime scene. Forensic chemist Richard Strobel.
I feel like I'm confronting a jigsaw puzzle, but it's much more difficult than the normal jigsaw puzzle. Not only have the pieces been segmented into many fragments, they've also been burned, discolored, damaged beyond recognition in some cases. The pieces aren't even there. So I have to put this jigsaw puzzle together with a very large number of handicaps.
And this case was one of the biggest challenges the lab has ever faced. In the mid-1980s, abortion clinics were under attack all over the country. The Washington, D.C. area was particularly hard hit with 2 arsons and 8 bombings. How these crimes were solved is a fascinating tale of scientific sleuthing. One that started with a couple of tiny particles, not much bigger than a grain of salt. Inside a fragment from the first abortion clinic bomb, Richard Strobel found a few grains of unconsumed explosive. Under X-ray analysis, the explosive is broken down into its chemical components.
What we're seeing from this particular printout up here is that we have 2 chemicals, sucrose, common table sugar, and a material called sodium chlorate, which from experience I know that we've confined in a commercial product known as Solidox.
Sodium chlorate, an oxidizer, is not an explosive by itself, and neither is sugar. But when mixed together, they can be deadly. And this bomber knew it.
The type of explosive he uses tells us a little bit about him. Is he a kid just experimenting by using match heads? Or is he a sophisticated international terrorist who's able to make a synthesized plastic explosive?
This bomber was neither, but he knew enough to mix his own explosive. And because it was so unusual, it became recognized as part of the bomber's signature. And would ultimately link the 8 bombings together. The 4th abortion-related bombing occurred in Annapolis, Maryland. When the lab pieced together the evidence from this incident, they noticed a terrifying change. The bomber had switched from relatively small pipe bombs to huge and more powerful gas cylinder bombs. It was bad news, but an important clue for the future.
Soon, he was going to run out of his supply of explosive, and he would have to make a change in his explosive formulation. It would be simply too risky for him to continue buying large quantities of Solidox. It would also be very expensive.
Found in the debris from the Annapolis bombing was this piece of a gas cylinder. Using a little whiteout to enhance visibility, a serial number appeared. It led investigators to the place the cylinder was purchased, unfortunately under an assumed name. There they discovered it was not the only cylinder. The bomber had bought 33 of them.
Once we knew he had that many cylinders, we knew his intent was to continue with his bombings, and he wouldn't stop till he was caught.
And they were right. The 5th and 6th bombings occurred on the same day, 10 minutes apart. With his 7th bomb, the bomber finally made the move that the lab had predicted. He changed his explosive. X-ray analysis revealed he was now using a mixture largely made up of potassium nitrate. The investigators tracked down where the new chemical was purchased, and eventually that led them to the buyer. With these signed receipts, the abortion clinic bombings were solved. Within a few weeks, 3 suspects were arrested: Thomas Spinks, Kenneth Shields, and Michael Bray, all members of a radical anti-abortion group. But an arrest does not close the case. Investigators have to come up with enough evidence for a conviction. They got that evidence in a search of the suspects' homes.
We were able to find the cylinders, we were able to find the raw materials, we were able to find a fingerprint. Out of all the tape, all the bombings, we were able to find only one latent print, and that one latent print matched up with one of the defendants.
A hair found at one bomb scene was matched to Michael Bray. Paint chips scratched from the cylinders matched paint chips found on Spinks's property. And finally, there was one piece of incontrovertible evidence.
Prior to the 8 bombings, there had been 2 arsons. And one of the pieces of physical evidence that we had from the very first arson was the wick of a Molotov cocktail that hadn't completely functioned. When we went to search Thomas Spinks's house, we asked Mrs. Spinks if she had any rags around, and there was a rag bag, and lo and behold, when we opened it up, we were able to find the perfect match for the material in the wick. And so that was pretty much...
No one was seriously injured in the abortion clinic bombings, but that was just a matter of luck. There was no such luck in this case, as 5-year-old Erin Bauer is rushed to a Lifeline helicopter after part of her left hand was blown off by a pipe bomb. Erin and her family were shopping at this Indianapolis Kmart. Like any 5-year-old, she grabbed at things on the shelf. Unfortunately for her, a pipe bomb was hidden in a most unsuspected place. After this crime scene video was taken, the evidence was collected. From the fragments, the ATF laboratory reconstructed a model of the bomb. And this is what it looked like. The lab added the cutaway to show the bomb inside, a pipe filled with gunpowder, and a layer of BBs that were added to increase the shrapnel effect. When the switch built into the cap was moved to the on position, the bomb was designed to explode when moved even slightly. No one knows how long it sat on the shelf before Erin touched it.
The husband had his child in his arms, running around. The mother was screaming. 2 men came up. Both of them just were paramedics. Her hand, I'm not sure how much, but several parts were actually blown off. And there was a lot of blood in her stomach, and it burned her clothes all through here.
We ran and we got ice because, to put her limbs in, and water, and, everybody tried to help out.
30 hours after the bombing, a local high school senior drove down this road and shot himself with a handgun. His name was David Swinford, and a family member called to report that he might have a connection with the bombing. It was up to the forensic lab to find out.
Things that became very important for us was to prove that he was indeed involved in the bombing case. Since we couldn't speak to him anymore, forensic science became the one last way for us to find out whether he was connected with that bombing incident at all.
Whoever built the bomb left invisible clues in the cap. A sharp tool had cut the hole where the switch was and left these marks behind. No 2 tools will leave the same marks. They're as individual as fingerprints. The hard part is finding the tool that made them. This knife was found in David Swinford's car. To examine the marks it leaves, impressions are made in a small slab of soft lead. The picture on the right is the impression from David's knife. On the left, the marks left in the plastic cap. The match is unmistakable. For investigators, the case could now be closed. Erin Bauer was blinded in one eye and has learned to use an artificial left hand. For the Bauer family, the wounds are healing. But they will probably never understand why this happened.
We don't really know what the bomber's real motive was in this particular case. We surmise that he had a beef against the store. That's the thing about bombs. They kill and injure their victims indiscriminately. The bomber doesn't always know who his victim is going to be.
One month after the bombing, the federal building in Oklahoma City was demolished, ironically, by explosives. While the people of Oklahoma City mourned their loss, an outraged nation was calling for something to be done to prevent such a horrific crime from ever happening again.
We pledge to do all we can to help you heal the injured, to rebuild this city, and to bring to justice those who did this evil.
Some people believe there is a better way to help track down a bomber, but it's a controversial one. These may look like grains of sand, but they're actually tiny chips of plastic called tagons, strong enough to survive an explosion. In theory, tagons could be added during the manufacturing process to anything that can be used in a bomb, from high explosives like dynamite to low explosives like gunpowder and even fertilizer. In a criminal bombing, the tagons would be scattered all over the crime scene where investigators could recover them, either by shining an ultraviolet light on them or by picking them up with magnets. Once recovered, they'd go directly to the lab. Put tagons under a high-power microscope and a rainbow of colors appear. The top white strip is the fluorescent layer. The other colors are a code that indicates when the explosive was made, who made it, and ultimately the retail location where it was sold. And that's how James McFillen was caught, and this grisly bombing solved.
The investigators that went to the scene had been trained in tagant recovery techniques. In fact, I think when they put the fluorescent light on the scene, one of the investigators said that it lit up like a Christmas tree. Tagants were then decoded by the laboratory, and they were used to trace actually the explosive that Mr. McFillen purchased from a dealer in West Virginia.
The McFillen bombing occurred more than 2 decades ago, when tagants were new and being tested in a pilot program. He was the first person to be caught and convicted with tagant evidence, and the only one. Shortly after the McFillen case, Congress stopped funding the tagant test when the explosive industry pulled out. The makers of high explosives were worried about safety. They also questioned the added costs when fewer than 4% of all criminal bombings involve commercial high explosives. And because of the role that high explosives play in our daily lives, the industry doubted the long-term value of tagons to law enforcement. A former chief of the FBI Explosives Unit now represents the industry.
The tagants in materials derived from explosives will live forever. So they will be in all the building blocks, and they'll be in all the roads, and they'll be in all the foodstuffs and things around agriculture where explosives are used.
3, 2, 1, fire, go!
It wouldn't be too many years before they would be so common that when you did a crime scene almost anywhere, you would be likely to find a tagant from contamination, but very seldom is it going to be from the bomb.
The average stick of dynamite in the tagant program had more than 2,000 tagants in it. So when you go to a scene and you're investigating, you may find stray tagants that were in the construction material, but the overwhelming concentration of tagants will be from the device itself.
The question is not only whether tagons can be made effective for law enforcement, but whether they will be accepted by industry.
20 years have passed, And at the time the Taggart research and pilot program was going on, everyone concluded that there needed to be more tests and there needed to be more study. We just haven't done it. And technology has changed and evolved over the years, that there may be something else out there, and we need to start funding and we need to start researching what those alternatives are.
It's unlikely that Taggins would have been much help in the Unabomb case. He used match heads as the explosive in his first 2 bombs, and since 1982 he used a mixture of chemicals that would never have been part of a tagging program.
When we knew we had a series of bombings perpetrated by one individual, all of the traditional techniques were used, and we found pretty quickly that the Unabomber recycled many common things, and he didn't buy components. There were no serial numbers. So the traditional techniques of tracing a component from a bomb didn't work. It didn't lead us anywhere. Another technique used in investigating bombings particularly is to look at the victimology. Who were his victims? What were the motives? How did they connect? What were the common aspects of each of these bombings?
Other than a link to science and technology, there were no obvious connections among his victims. So investigators took another approach to help track down the bomber. This is the FBI Investigative Support Unit in Quantico, Virginia. Here, behavioral scientists study every piece of evidence collected on a case.
The way the body was deposited, the type of ligature strangulation.
Their goal is to create a profile, a behavioral portrait of the person who committed the crime.
They're suspicious of others.
While the technique of profiling has been refined at the FBI, it didn't start there. It began with another case, another serial bomber, more than 50 years ago.
Looking at the story of the Mad Bomber is almost a template for Unabomb. There are a lot of similarities between the two in the way they've done their crimes, and I'm confident that we'll find there's a lot of similarities between the two in their psychiatric or psychological makeup.
The case of the Mad Bomber began in 1940 when an unexploded bomb was discovered at a Consolidated Edison building in Manhattan. Like the Unabomber's first incident, this event went virtually unnoticed. Inside, they found a note. It was signed FP, and it took 16 years to learn what those initials stood for, about the same time it took to discover what the Unabomber's FC means. The Mad Bomber placed a second device also at Con Ed 1 year later. Then, like the Unabomber, his bombs stopped for years.
When somebody stops committing crimes, as in the case of Unabomb, there's a lot of speculation that the individual was in jail or committed to a mental institution or hopefully blew himself up.
But the Mad Bomber told police why he stopped: patriotism. He promised to cease his bomb activities until World War II was over. And he kept his promise. When the Mad Bomber resumed his activities in 1951, his devices were bigger and more powerful. Like the Unabomber, he too fabricated most of his bomb components. By 1956, he had placed about 30 bombs and widened his targets from Con Ed to libraries, theaters, and department stores. The injuries were mounting, and the city was terrified. The final straw occurred at the Paramount Theater in December 1956. The largest bomb yet exploded, seriously injuring 7 people. The New York bomb squad was desperate.
They'd run out of clues. They had no other directions particularly. They were looking around for other ways of trying to generate leads and probably in desperation went to Dr. Brussel.
With the Mad Bomber case, Dr. James Brussel, a psychiatrist with the New York Department of Mental Health, invented the modern science of criminal profiling. With the entire file laid out on his desk, he began a journey into the mind of the mad bomber. In his letters, the bomber kept referring to his chronic illness for which he held Con Ed responsible. What kind of man would harbor a grudge for 16 years? For a psychiatrist, the answer was easy. Someone who suffered from the mental disorder paranoia.
The paranoid, by definition, is in his own mind or her own mind a perfect being. They don't make mistakes. They are not crazy. Their word is the accurate word. So if things keep going wrong, obviously it has to be something causing things to go wrong.
Since the symptoms of paranoia usually show up after age 20, Brussel pinned the bomber's age at no less than 35. In his letters, the use of old-fashioned phrases like dastardly deeds could mean the bomber was an immigrant or the child of immigrants. Finally, using Freudian theory, Brussel saw the bomber's underlying problem as sexual. From that, he could draw more assumptions about how this criminal lived.
He included the fact that he would live with a female relative, that one or more. It also included the fact that he was not married, had probably never been married, and was a virgin, although not homosexual, as Brussel said.
And in a final bit of bravado, he predicted that when this bomber was caught, he would be wearing a double-breasted suit, buttoned. With an approximate age of the bomber, police intensified their efforts, even searching through driver's license signatures. On Christmas Day, 1956, Brussel's profile was published. It would ultimately solve the case. Alice Kelly, a secretary at Con Ed, read the profile in the papers. For days, she had been scouring old files for employees with health complaints. Then she found this one, a man injured in a boiler accident. On sick pay for months, he was dropped from the roster when doctors found nothing wrong. He spent the next 3 years writing angry letters. And in them, dastardly deeds. That uncommon phrase mentioned in the profile was used repeatedly. Alice Kelly saved this file for the police. It led them to this house in Waterbury, Connecticut. When George Metesky answered the door, he confessed immediately. The capture of the Mad Bomber of New York made national news.
A 16-year hunt for New York's Mad Bomber ends with the arrest and confession of George Metesky, a toolmaker.
The first question police asked Metesky was what FP stood for. He smiled and answered, fair play.
At his Waterbury home, where he lived with two maiden sisters, police found a garage workbench and parts for the explosive handiwork.
While profiles aren't always as accurate as this one, they can be a helpful tool.
Now, you don't know what will happen now, I suppose.
Well, I can hope for the best at the bottom.
Yeah.
Just as Dr. Brussel predicted, when George Metesky was captured, he was wearing a double-breasted suit, buttoned. How close was the profile in the Unabomb case to Theodore Kaczynski, the accused Unabomber?
Dr. Kaczynski was a loner, socially isolated, even though he was a lot more socially isolated than we expected. His workplace and so forth was, and craftsmanship was what we expected it would be. He was the outspoken kind of person who was considered eccentric by his neighbors. That's what we figured. He was highly intelligent, although better educated than we might have expected.
For the first 15 years, the Unabomber carried out his violent crimes in virtual silence. Investigators could only speculate why he was bombing. Then he went public with a 35,000-word manifesto published in August 1995. In it, he revealed his hatred for science and technology and justified his violence. At the same time, he finally disclosed what FC stands for.
Unabomb is driven by emotional storms that we can only vaguely understand. And that mailing of that manuscript, propelled by those emotional storms, is what led to his downfall. The irony will be that this man will in part be convicted by science and technology which he spurns, looking at an old typewriter which is outdated, but which is so unique that it can be compared to his writings. The wires, the scraps of dust, the very dirt in his cabin, the sandpaper, the wood, every scrap of physical evidence will be subjected to high technology to convict Unabom.
After Kaczynski's arrest, investigators prepared for trial, looking for items in his cabin that matched evidence from 16 bombings, like the tool that stamped FC into the bomb that injured Gary Wright, or splinters that matched wood from the bomb that killed Hugh Scruton, or slivers of metal that matched the fragments that still remain in John Hauser's injured arm. But in the end, there would be no need. Kaczynski pled guilty in 1998. There was no trial.
Equal to gamma squared integral 0 to
Today, John Hauser has learned to write with his left hand. He's found a new career as a professor and a researcher.
We'd have our result here, okay?
He also makes time to sing in a chorus. John is luckier than some bombing victims. He survived, and he found the strength to rebuild his life.
Clear!
While he can't fly the jets he loved so much, he does fly a light plane, one that makes fewer demands on a pilot's dexterity.
I could become very bitter, I suppose, but life's too precious for that. You know, I mean, if there's a blockage in this direction, find another direction and go with it. I mean, there's too many wonderful things for me to spend too much time, too much energy thinking about the Unabomber.
To respond to this program or to find out more about NOVA, visit NOVA's website at pbs.org. To order the show for $19.95 plus shipping and handling, call 1-800-255-9424. And to learn more about how science can solve the mysteries of our world, ask about our many other NOVA videos. NOVA is a production of